Hello, I'm Stuart Craner. Welcome to this session, which is part of 3 days of webinars venturing into the ecosystem future. I'm director of the Business Ecosystem Alliance, and we're delighted once again to be partnering with the Higher Model Institute on this virtual event, exploring the very latest thinking and best practice in the field of business ecosystems. We're excited that people from more than 50 countries worldwide have signed up for these sessions. So welcome to you, wherever you are joining from Australia to Zambia. Please send in your comments, thoughts, questions, and queries at any time during the sessions. So our next session combines leading edge thinking and research with best global practice. I'm delighted to welcome back London Business School's Michael Jacobides, one of the most notable thought leaders in the world of ecosystems. Michael is joined by Giuseppe Stigliano, who is Global CEO of Spring Studios, and the consultant, teacher, and researcher, Yuri Romanekov. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. Speaking about what we have learned in terms of ecosystems, not just by research, that's where I spend part of my time, but also learning from practice. So we'll have the opportunity to hear from two people I've had the privilege to work with in different contexts. Giuseppe Stigliano, who's the global CEO of Spring Studio, which is an integrated advertising and communications and events firm with footprints on both sides of the Atlantic, has looked at ecosystems, and we also have the pleasure of working with Spring Studios, working with Evolution Limited. And Evolution Limited is an advisory that has been set up again in an ecosystem fashion with no permanent employees to avoid having the risk of trying to simply sell advisory, but bringing together people who are interested to inform cutting-edge practitioners on the basis of where research is. So we'll start thinking about ecosystems in the world of media, but also the world of consumer products. And we'll think about what that means when we think to shift from products to experience ecosystems. We'll then shift in our discussion with Yuri to look at the internal ecosystems, drawing on a recent project that we did with one of the Gulf's biggest conglomerates that is involved in retail and property and entertainment, before having a video with our final guest who did not appear in the first video, which is Katie Round. A different hat that I had is that I'm an academic advisor to Boston Consulting Group's Henderson Institute, and we've been looking at the metaverse, which has been a fantastic story of hyperbole and overexcitement in the beginning, and then disappointment thereafter. And it raises tons of really interesting ecosystem questions about why we saw this hyperbole, what has led to the disappointment, and what can we take away looking at the future. But first things first, Beppe, let me turn to you. And I'd like to see from the perspective of a practitioner, if we can understand what these experience ecosystems are and what they mean. Why would a firm that's in a non-technology area be interested to shift from product to ecosystem? And what does that mean?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for this invitation. It's very appreciated, and it's a privilege to share my experience and my thoughts with all of you. And thanks, Michael, and you recalled our experience together, and that's actually it is a great example of an ecosystem. But we'll get there in a second. I would say that based on my experience, so in the last 20 years, I've been dealing with at least 100 different companies on a global scale. And they actually went from a strong focus on their value proposition, let's call it a product or a service, and this idea that they can exploit that competitive advantage and that value proposition with limited innovation for a number of years. They started realizing that thanks or because of the so-called digital transformation or digital revolution, the experiential benchmarks set by the best-in-class players, typically digitally natives, were so high, the bar of expectations was so high that they had to constantly rethink that value proposition. Now, back in the day, the response to this sort of need or urgency was make, buy, or ally. You can make something, you can come up with something new, you can come up with something innovative or perceived as innovative, or you can buy smaller competitor, another company, so that you can revitalize your value proposition, or you can work in terms of alliances. I say back in the day because it's actually more complicated these days. So I would say that the make is still an option, and we see that in many cases. We see that every time that the company play within the wheel of the current industry, and they come up with a new formula, a new taste, a new flavor. And it's still happening, and it's actually my worst nightmare as a marketer, because it typically happens that you are there, you meet with a company, and you ask them, what is your competitive advantage? What makes you different from your competitors? And when the answer you get is, you should tell me, it's a nightmare. It means that there is not an actual difference, and what they expect is that the agency comes up with something fancy and creative that can make up and so it's not the real solution. And again, it's my worst nightmare. When it's an actual new formula, a new taste, a new flavor, it's a good way. It's an interesting way to stay within the boundaries of your industry and do something new, something innovative. Option 2, you start collaborating with someone else. Now, what does this mean? Well, different things. You can collaborate. For example, the recent scandal, if compared to the traditional idea of the partnership between Tiffany and Nike, I think it's a great example of what building a partnership means today. Different industries, completely different audiences, completely different brands with a different background, decide to work together and to come up with something clever, new, innovative, to serve the audience in a different way. Very interesting opportunity. You can cooperate, and this is based on my experience, something very interesting, the collaboration between Reebok Europe and Zalando. So I was working with Cristiano Fagnani, who is now the CEO of Reebok Europe, based out of Milan. And he went from considering Zalando yet another e-commerce platform where they were selling their products to consider them consider Zalando a strategic alliance to disclose, or as I like to say, open the API of the company, expose the APIs of the company to the partner in a way that the partner could fully integrate and have full visibility in terms of inventory management, everything basically, so that at some point they became one company to some extent. And as we know, in these cases, the sum is stronger and higher and bigger than the single components, the single parts. And so this is an interesting experience that I had, where you work with a partner, then that collaboration becomes a strategic alliance, and at some point you literally decide to build an initial, let's say, ecosystem. Or another example that I've been involved in the recent years is when it comes to the collaboration between an established player that find itself in the situation where, again, they need to cope with change, they need to deal with constantly evolving experiential benchmarks, and they decide to work with startups. So I was part of a venture incubator called H-Farm a few years ago, and we've worked with many companies, and the idea was either to build a corporate accelerator program, so basically receive a brief from the company and look for startups in a number of fields, with service lines or value propositions that were complementary to the one of the corporate, of the established company, in a way that was able to build synergies and partnerships. And that's one.
Let me just summarize to ensure that we all get part of the aha here. So the first thing is that the problem starts because you can't simply rely on the traditional way of competing and innovating, because the cycle has become much faster. And frankly, this is good. I mean, we were used to being abused by a few firms that weren't terribly innovative because they had chokehold on distribution channels. And one of the changes that has happened with the digital economy is that we have learned to expect much more. So the question is, when you want much more, where will the more come from? The where that will come from is not only from within the firm and, you know, getting more people or simply buying the stuff that you provide, but finding new and potentially flexible ways of aligning. One of the benefits of the Nike and Tiffany relationship is that they are together, but they will become further apart and then they will reconnect. Or you have other alliances in the luxury world that I know that you've been involved in, like, for instance, Smeg and Missoni, to get, or Dolce & Gabbana, to get sort of fancy brands that can create stuff that, coming from very different stables, still are able to create joint value. But let me go to the final bit, because the final bit that you mentioned is not just either rethinking how you can connect with companies, whether you can leverage your complementary skills, where there is very little overlap. But you started saying that you can actually build an ecosystem, which means a slightly more structured or permanent or broad scope offering. What is different from a strong alliance to building an ecosystem? And when we speak in the world of both the products or companies like yours that are involved in advising the clients in how the products, perhaps the experience, should be packaged, what's new and what does the ecosystem bring?
Yeah, well, in my experience, this is what I like to say, what I like to call exposing the APIs of the company. It's the moment where the company decides to fully collaborate with third parties, being the core of the ecosystem, the center of the ecosystem, or being perhaps a complementer of somebody else's ecosystem, a partner of someone else. But the idea of exposing the API is this idea that all involved parties have this unique opportunity to build something greater than the sum of its parts. I think this is the core of the idea. And by the way, in my upcoming book, one of the guiding principles that Professor Kotler and I share for retailers is be exponential. So this idea that if you follow this principle, if you expose your APIs, if you collaboratively work with third parties in a constructive way, in a structural way, as you've said, you are exponentially bigger than what you actually are, than your actual value proposition, because you can work with a number of complementors. And by the way,
so what I hear you say is two things. The first thing is that the difference between collaborations and ecosystems is that ecosystems involve greater amount of openness and also greater amount of churn in terms of where the ideas come from, and the number of complementers broaden up. So that's a helpful one to consider. Let me now ask you to wrap up in giving us one specific example. And you know, we've had the pleasure of collaborating
absolutely.
in a project which is an ecosystem. Can you give us an example of what an ecosystem in an FMCG?
I was getting there because it's absolutely a great example. So this idea of being open, this idea of collaborate, this idea of established structural collaboration with third parties and churn. I like your definition, because the ideas can come from different parts. We found ourselves working with a company that, for an Italian like me, is an institution, and I'm talking about Lavazza. So Lavazza is a very interesting company which went from being the majority of its business in Italy to being a truly global company in a few years. And so they found themselves with a number of ventures, with a number of different brands, with a number of collaborations, partnerships in place, and also with this idea that they needed to evolve or shift from a product-centered value proposition to an experience-focused value proposition. And so they actually, so the combined efforts, we joined efforts of Spring Studios and Evolution Ltd. We joined forces to support the company in this delicate balance between building an ecosystem, leveraging internal options, let's say, and also external options, which is, I guess, the very important final point, talking about wrapping up. The idea that, especially if you are an established organization, especially if you've been around for a century or a lot of time, chances are that you have a lot of different brands, collaborations, ventures. And so, yes, of course, you need to look outside and you need to explore the market and look for external third parties to work with, so that you can, exposing your APIs, you can find complementors to work with, or you can be complementary to someone else. However, you also need to find a clever way to leverage what you have in-house, so that you you get the most out of what you are for.
Absolutely, and we will return to part of these topics in the conversation. Now, Beppe told us something really interesting. First of all, the difference between simply collaborations and ecosystems that are both more open and more dynamic in terms of their churn. But also, he told us that it is not straightforward, and having been involved working with Beppe and his team, as well as the team of Evolution, one of the biggest challenges is the internal dynamics, because an organization is not a human being. An organization, in terms of the CEO, in terms of the board, in terms of the chief marketing officer, whoever is driving it, may want to engage with external parties. But you got to speak with the people who run sales, who run operations, who run marketing, and you've got to align not only the relationships that you can get if the company was a person that is all well unified and well aligned, but you got to find a way of making that work with the internal bits and pieces. And this quite often is where the idea of building an ecosystem stops, because it's a great PowerPoint, but it needs a lot of work. Now, let me turn to something that will relate to that. And Beppe, thank you so much. We'll return to our conversation towards the end when we try to wrap up, and introduce Yuri, because I'd like to give another example. Just for full disclosure, Yuri, who's now involved in London Business School, and he's going to be the program director of the new 5-day open executive education course we have, next generation digital strategies. We'll be speaking about ecosystems, as well as platforms and AI, and all the exciting new developments in April of 2024. He's also a senior advisor at Evolution Limited, and who was involved not only in the project with Beppe and myself and Lavazza, but also working for the group CEO in one of the Gulf's biggest companies. And that takes us to the internal ecosystems. Every year, I write an email providing my views and what's happening in the world, and what are the key trends, and a bit of an angle on ecosystems. And I got an email from the group CEO who says, you know what, he was one of the divisional CEOs that just promoted a group, and says, I'd like to see whether our group is really a value accretive ecosystem. I didn't know what he meant. I thought that sounds fascinating, and flew to the Middle East, and we had some conversations, and I said I'd be happy to give you an external vantage point. But then what I realized is that what he really meant is how the different bits and parts of my own business empire communicate and operate with each other. So it's the problem that Beppe alluded to that we see in all these organizations. But there, what you have to think of is a multi-billion-dollar organization. how the different bits and pieces create these synergies. That's the focus on what I'm now working on, and hopefully there's going to be a paper on that soon, looking at internal ecosystems. And internal ecosystems are somewhere in between speaking about ecosystems and thinking about corporate strategy, the way in which one large corporate animal with a footprint in different areas can ensure that the whole is indeed bigger, because sometimes it is smaller than the sum of its parts. So what are the main issues and challenges there? So Yuri, we spent some time scratching our heads and trying to figure out what were the takeaways that we saw from looking at these difficult realities.
Michael, perhaps providing a little bit of extra context for the benefit of our audience. The real underlying question, like you alluded to from the group CEO, was, do these businesses belong together? You know, are they better off together? Should we have them all versus should we not? Which, of course, is a very loaded question. It's one of the perennial questions of corporate strategy, ultimately. And how can ecosystem thinking and ecosystem value creation help inform the best possible view as to which businesses belong together versus which ones don't, and what form that should take? So together with the evolution team, we looked at two fundamental questions to answer that. The first question, of course, is there any ecosystem synergy beneath these businesses? And what are these synergies? And I'll address that in a second. And then the second question is, to the extent that there are any synergies, what is the right corporate model or the right alignment structure to pursue them for maximum value creation capture? So we started off, as you remember, by essentially taking a really hard look at what are the actual benefits of these businesses working together. And when you think about synergies and the way that most people think about what a synergy is, sort of traditionally, one would think about basic things like scale. You know, I'm going to be bigger, so I'm going to be able to negotiate with my suppliers better. Or they think about cross-sell. You know, I'm going to take my brands and put them on the distribution rails of this company that I'm going to acquire, for example. And these, of course, all of these things are valid, and many of them were also valid for the conglomerate and the Gulf that we're discussing here. But more interestingly, what we uncovered through our work was a whole layer of ecosystem synergies in addition to that. Like, for example, creating value for the customer from consuming two complementary products together, or for creating one-stop shops for consumers where they're able to find solutions to their integrated problems, or from leveraging big data in not just a simple cross-sell way, but to integrate the front and the back ends of that business, and again, increase both productivity and customer value at the same time. So I guess what we're learning from that project is we're learning that the ecosystem synergies are qualitatively different from many of the traditional synergies, and recognizing them can unlock significant amounts of value for multi-business firms, like the conglomerate that we were looking at. But then, of course, the question remains, echoing what Beppe was saying just a few minutes ago. There's a range of corporate options. You can buy or you can build. You can partner with someone. You know, how do you decide what is the right way of pursuing those synergies between them?
Before we go there, let me just stop to make sure that we've captured part of what you've mentioned, or perhaps reiterated, and to say that in the traditional multi-business organizations, the synergies tended to be fairly straightforward. You have some economies of scale or economies of scope. There are some resources that you can share, or there are some advantages in access and everything from back office to finance. These are the normal ones, but the other benefits that you're saying are the ones that one could call super additive, i.e. something that provides a super additive benefit, whereby the consumption and A and B together is a nice bundle. And that's part of what you see in these multi-product ecosystems. And there's the paper that draws on some of the projects that we did in the California Management Review. I'm proud to say that it got the Paper of the Year award in 2023 that provides an example of some of these multi-product ecosystems, and what underpins them is this super additivity that exists either on the consumption or the production side. And this is what underpins the ecosystems, and that's what could make them possibly exponential, to borrow Beppe's earlier language. So that's the good news. And you're like, yeah, I may have some benefits. But let's now go to the bad news, because this is what lures you in saying, oh my God, I can create value. But then what is the hindrance between your idea of the value that you will create and the value that you really can have? Right. So give us a sense there, Yuri.
And Michael, just before we get into it, I think just to amplify the point you just made, I think a practical observation I'm deriving from that work together was that whereas the more traditional synergies, because they're so straightforward, they're typically on the surface and they're more or less obvious to everyone, to executives, to boards, to potential acquirers, to private equity investors, and so on. Whereas the super additive synergies that you were just referring to, the ecosystem layer of value creation, is typically a lot more complex and nuanced. Which is why part of the lesson for me personally from that project was just how important it is to go really deep in understanding the nature of the product, understanding the brands, understanding the business model, to be able to distill that complementarity that underpins the super additive synergies, Michael, you were just talking about. And like you said, at the end of the day, even if you do find these synergies, how do you pursue them in a way that can create as much value as possible and destroy as little value as possible? Because the natural
and just to give an example to our listeners, and I'll draw from another setting. So let's think about telcos. I had the privilege of working with Ernest Koo, the CEO of Globe Telecom in the Philippines, and Manish Benga, who runs MásMóvil. And they both have created very strong ecosystems. Ernest managed to be the only telco that has spawned a unicorn when all telcos were sort of withering, and Mani has created $8 billion worth of value for his firms in less than a decade. One of the ways that they've done that is that they have looked at ecosystems, but they've done it by being very pragmatic, by saying not only will we create the benefit, but we're going to be measuring it. And we're going to be looking at the extent of churn of the people who consume these additional services, and then say, do we get any benefit in the core business? And as a result, is there any monetization benefit by expanding the footprint of our ecosystem? Not only is this a good idea, but if I sell insurance, are the people who buy telco and insurance less likely to churn? Because if they are, that is money directly down to my bottom line. So you can start seeing what are these benefits, going back to the bundles that Beppe was saying, that create an advantage. Because otherwise you just try to put your spaghetti in the wall and you don't even know whether it's stuck or not. But very quickly, as time flies, tell us about the downsides, Yuri.
And the downside, of course, is that the instinct for most business leaders is to say, well, if I see a synergy, that means I need to buy that player, or I need to build something like that within my organization, build an internal ecosystem, and that's going to be the solution to realize all of these synergies. The challenge with that, of course, is synergies also come with the dark side. They come with costs. Be it costs from agencies of all sorts, where not the value creation is being put front and center, but a range of incentives that might exist in parallel, and so on, so on, so on. So complexity that it creates internally is costly and can create a downside to some of these ecosystem synergies. So what we looked at together with that conglomerate in the Middle East was where do we actually see a justification for realizing these synergies through an internal ecosystem versus where can we open up the API, to use Beppe's language, and open up to potential external partners where we may be able to mitigate some of these downsides, reduce the complexity, bring in external partners, small or large numbers, various levels of integration, to be able to realize the same synergies without necessarily having to invest all the capex.
Terrific. And this is the question about openness and the bias. So one thing that I would emphasize, it suggests that the traditional companies who want to take advantage of all of these synergies internally may be essentially as strong as their weakest link, whereas the ecosystems have got the benefit of dynamism, hence my use of the word churn. And there's another question, which is, how do you think about the relationship to the external environment? Let me give you one specific example from what we saw. Imagine that you have one of the biggest malls. The way that you may think about it is, I have malls and I also own a company that operates hotels. Why? Because I think that hotels drive mall shopping drives benefit. Okay, sure, hotel ownership may drive benefits, but why on earth do you want to own them? Why do you not create some ecosystem where you don't deploy the capital, because you don't need to? You don't need to have them inside. It's funny because the chap that was running that part of the business told us, oh, well, the problem is that they even say the name of our mall and we need to sue them because they shouldn't be saying that. I'm like, you should do the exact opposite. What you should be doing is that you should invite all the hotels, and you're going to have different tiers, gold, silver, and bronze. And the better service ones, you should just buy them buses. It is much cheaper than you having hotels that you operate. You will regulate the quality. You will drive benefits for the stuff that you're doing. And if you build an ecosystem that manages the relationships, you can keep your cake and eat it. You can have the synergies without having some of the costs, and you must have a much more flexible way of creating these benefits, which is also what Beppe was telling us. So is there a benefit? Yes. And the fascinating thing with strategy is that when you think about these ecosystem benefits, they put into fresh perspective some of the big corporate strategy questions in terms of, what do I need to have in my footprint? How do I open up? And how do I not take the inertia and the politics that inevitably in all organizations happens inside the firm, stop us from taking advantage of the possibilities of linking outside? Frankly, sometimes the same dynamics may hurt us because we're not able to take advantage of even the internal units, but we're able to have two birds with one stone if we think about the ecosystem strategy and how do we open up in addition to the corporate strategy as we do this systemic rethink. Now, for the final bit that connects strategy and practice and research, let me now turn to the research collaboration that draws on the work that we've done with Hansen Institute, where I've been working for the last few years. There was a terrific paper that we did a couple of years ago on the AI ecosystems, something that's now becoming quite pertinent. We're now starting to do some new work on the generative AI ecosystems and how these will affect firms that engage with them. But the work that you will hear from is work that looked at how we can learn from the metaverse, which itself is an ecosystem. Katie Round was very much wanted to be with us, but she is unfortunately in an international flight, so she's over an ocean right now. But I still wanted to have her as she did some of the heavy lifting presenting. So let me just ask if we can hear the video. Welcome to the recorded part of our webinar. This is me just before we start, and I am speaking with Katie Round, who is in BCGX, as well as in BHI, the BCG Health Institute, where I am an academic advisor, and I have the pleasure of working with Katie and its global managing director, François Condelon, and others on some exciting projects relating to ecosystems, including, in particular, the metaverse. Now, Katie, one would have thought metaverse, this is so much last year's buzzword, it's totally dead. Is it totally dead? And what happened and people got excited and then we forgot about it?
Yeah, so certainly there was a lot of hype around this a couple of years ago, and now it seems like it's a lot less interest in the metaverse. But I think the first thing that we need to look at, and what we looked at in our research, was actually when we talk about the metaverse, there's two very distinct points of the metaverse. So there's one which is around the immersive metaverse, which is really using AR and VR to enhance our digital experiences and merge physical and digital. And this is really dominated by players like Meta and Microsoft, who were looking to enhance collaboration, enhance the social worlds. And then you have a look at it from the Web3 angle. And this was really around creating digital economies within digital worlds where users own their digital assets and you can build virtual worlds, virtual wearables, virtual gaming. So very, very distinct use cases.
So we don't have a metaverse where we have metaverses, and we'll see what the distinctions even within these metaverses are. And why were these stuck? What is it that made them not take off?
Yeah, so if you have a look at it from the immersive metaverse, and like I said, this is dominated by players like Meta and Microsoft. And I think the very first problem that you look at there is the motivations behind why they wanted to do it was to really extend their ecosystems and extend what they were doing within the digital world currently and moving it into the metaverse. So you look at Microsoft, they wanted to build new devices and new software to enhance collaboration within the metaverse, or to build a new industrial metaverse to help enterprises with things like digital product delivery and training. You look at the likes of Meta, and they wanted to bring their social platform to the digital world, and the way that they did that was by controlling and the hardware and the software, and really trying to own and dominate what they built within the metaverse by extending their visions. And one of the big problems with that is actually, instead of looking to collaborate and see what are the best use cases that they can deliver to their customers, and it was very much focused on how can they carve up this pie, and really they failed to deliver the value proposition. The hardware was just not good enough. It was too clunky. It was just not fit for purpose. The virtual worlds didn't have the right level of experience in there. And so instead of having a look at, okay, what's the end value proposition that we're trying to build, it was really around, okay, can we fight to get the best devices or fight to get the most people in our world, and failed to deliver the proposition.
So a bit of a case of greed, trying to move from 30% that you would get in the App Store to close to 50% in terms of the share of revenue, and trying to create an ecosystem where you focus so much on value distribution that you lose sight of value creation. I think a broader lesson in terms of ecosystems and the fascinating stuff in the metaverse is that it really gives us a good understanding of what works and what doesn't in terms of ecosystems. So if you think about these big immersive plays, they are built to sustain the multi-product ecosystem that these firms have across different domains and ensure that they keep their dominance intact. And B, they fail because there is so much focus on getting a distributional advantage that the functional benefit simply ends up falling by the wayside, and value creation has the back seat. So eventually it doesn't pan out. Now, let me ask you, because you mentioned that in addition to these, we have the Web3 types of metaverses, which are ecosystems of players that do not like the dominance of a few big players and want to play in rules that are more democratic. It sounds wonderful. Why did it not manage to take off?
Yeah, and I think there are a few different reasons for that. So we look at the likes of the Sandbox and Decentraland, and what they were doing is, building digital experiences that were powered by NFTs, so different digital tokens that users could own and sell. There was a huge crash in the market, at the end of 2022 with NFTs. So the whole value of those really fell and went down. And the other reason that you have a look at is what they also tried to do was build their own virtual world and tried to bring audiences from other places into those worlds. You look at the likes of Metaverse Fashion Week, and actually what they're trying to do was, how do you create new worlds and bring people in, rather than, if you look at what some others did, so the likes of Nike, when they partnered with Roblox, for example, there was already millions of users within that world, and what they did is brought their offerings to, and their brands to Roblox, where there were already a number of different users, and that's where you see the more successes. Similar if you look at virtual concerts, so Travis Scott, for example, and his concert in Fortnite, there were already a lot of fans, and what they tried to do is, how do you enhance experience in there, rather than recreating and building worlds where you had to bring the users to. So I think that starts to explain why some of these are more successful and some of them weren't working quite as they expected.
So the important thing to remember here is that there are some rules that can distinguish things that work and things that don't, that we do see some variance, and perhaps the hype with the metaverse was such that because people found it in their own interest, companies found it in their own interest to perhaps overhype it, the exact opposite of what you would have thought in the classic disruption theory. And also, they weren't that good in managing the ecosystems, either because they were focusing too much on the value distribution as opposed to value creation, or because they were not thinking about what are the underlying principles in terms of the things that may be able to add some value. And for those of you who are interested, our research on what we can learn in the growth and the demise of excitement for the metaverse, which, by the way, is continuing. And we expect that as AR and VR will continue developing, it may return back to the scene, subtler but stronger than it was before, can give us some valuable pointers in terms of what works and what doesn't in terms of the metaverse. And let me end with a bit of a forward-looking question. You've looked at a number of these efforts, especially in the more decentralized world of Web3, and there still is excitement, but there are things holding them back. What do you think is holding them back, and can we expect that perhaps if we get some of the principles that underpin successful ecosystem building, might we see the development of new ecosystems that are less centralized than the ones that we see dominating business activities today?
Yeah, I think so. So one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is a lot of partnerships in this area. So if you have a look at, the likes of Microsoft and Nvidia, who are really looking to partner to dominate and to work on creating the industrial metaverse. And there's some really interesting use cases that are coming out of there. And actually, we're starting to see more adoption in there now that there's these partnerships happening. And similarly, Meta and Microsoft have collaborated using the MetaQuest hardware and the Microsoft collaboration. And then you look at Apple entering the market with their hardware, and I think you're going to start to see more acceleration and better hardware for the immersive worlds. And then you have a look at the likes of Roblox, which actually is somewhere between Web3 and Web2, not fully Web3, but it is owned and built by the developers. And there's huge amounts of activity in there, and you can see that those are going from strength to strength. So I think there's definitely more to come with the metaverse in both Web3 and immersive experiences, especially when you look at more partnerships in this area.
Excellent. So look at what works and look at what doesn't. Understand why it in the metaverse is a terrific example in terms of building ecosystems, poorly sometimes, overly aggressively sometimes, but we do expect that the world will change. And we expect that as these complementary technologies develop, the possibility for new types of organization and for these fundamental and open questions of how centralized or decentralized can we hope that the development of technologies may be, is going to start being part of the story again. So watch this space, much more to come. And Katie, thank you so much for your discussion today.
Thank you.
So there you have it. As you can see, lots happening. Ecosystems, a promising way of organizing, but you can get it right and you can get it wrong. Stuart, we have time for very quick questions for our guests.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really, really good discussion. Let's start with a question for Beppe. I think the relationship between collaborations and ecosystems is really interesting. You talked about it. Are collaborations the starting point for ecosystems? There's kind of a chicken and egg, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But I don't think an ecosystem can be built unless there is this mindset. Sometimes we refer to this mindset, this approach, as open innovation, which is this idea that instead of looking, it's typically, back in the day was, oh, my research and development team is working on something and they are 100% accountable and responsible to come up with something relevant for my company. While open innovation is this idea that, well, yes, of course, there might be someone who is responsible, but in the majority of companies, not all of them, in some cases, pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, they still must rely on internal innovation more than others. But for the majority of companies, including FMCG companies, as we were saying, it is actually a great idea to stop relying solely on their own forces and explore collaboratively the possibility to work with third parties.
And you also talked about large established companies working with startups and vice versa. But historically, the gulf between them, the gulf of misunderstanding is quite large between established companies and smaller ones. Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely, yes. And I went through that so many times. So I can confirm that, it's about people, it's about culture, it's about of course different cultures, it's about typically bringing in an established organization, small, nimble, probably tech-focused and very young group of people. And so, of course, there is a cultural clash. There is this fear of losing control, or what's going to happen if they accelerate too much, if they bring us in a wrong direction. What do we do if the mother company cannibalize the emerging one, or vice versa, if the impact of the emerging one, of the acquired one, or the startup we collaborate with is too strong and culturally breaks everything, and we lose control. We're no longer able to deliver the standard of quality that our partners and clients are used to. There are intellectual property concerns in many cases. Startups tend to be more agile, even in the way they approach legal matters, while established organizations can't. And of course, there is an opportunity cost every time. There is an opportunity cost because they look at, oh, should I work with this startup, perhaps working on NFTs and the metaverse, or it's just the next hype, potentially the next big thing, but it's too early. Perhaps I should focus my budget, my energy, my resources on something that is more actionable in the short term. Shall I, focus on something that is happening now, or with the risk of missing the train, as we say, or should I be future focused? Big questions, and there is not a one-size-fits-all approach, of course.
Yeah. Yuri, you were talking about internal ecosystem synergies, and that they require deep understanding. And it struck me that how do you acquire the deep understanding? And if you require deep understanding for internal ecosystems, which you can see is achievable because you know the organization, external ecosystems, the deep understanding must be even more demanding, more elusive.
Stuart, I think you're absolutely spot on in a sense that the depth of understanding of the industry and the sort of the ecosystem around it is sort of almost relatively rarely seen, at least in my experience. But I think, as we've learned from both this project and a number of other projects, reaching that level of understanding can then unlock monumental value for businesses. So, and I've been speaking to a number of private equity investors recently, for example, who all said to me that whenever they enter a new ecosystem, because it's now sort of almost more helpful to think about ecosystems and industries, really going through a comprehensive exercise of speaking to many stakeholders, speaking to many industry experts externally, understanding the product, understanding its use case, engaging in consumer insights. So building almost a puzzle from many small pieces that you put together, both from your internal sources, but very, very importantly, from so many sources outside, helps you really build a picture of the hydraulics, if you wish, of that ecosystem. And sort of, if you push a little bit here, where is it going to reverberate? Because it can reverberate in places where maybe you least expected it. And really building that highly nuanced understanding can really result in an advantage that is much stronger than a more superficial sense of let's just take this brand and put this on these distribution rails, or let's just build a big company that is going to be a powerful beast in a jungle, right? So I think this is sort of what we're learning from many projects like this.
If I could just piggyback on what Yuri said, because we've been in some of these projects together, I'm quite surprised and more optimistic, perhaps, Stuart, in the sense that people in the operating units are quite often have got a very good idea of what they could be doing once they start opening up. So I think that although at the level of the corporate, the value is not being added because there's all manner of traditional siloization, I think that you see in the operating businesses people who say, but what about this great idea? Wouldn't we be able to connect outside? And then a decent job of cataloging the wisdom that is within the organization with some jolts from the outside, an external vantage point, can in fairly short order provide a mapping. And the mapping is sort of exciting stuff because people, the organization, say, blimey, that's interesting. So I don't think that this is so difficult that it is not achievable. I think that I'd almost say the inverse. This is what Yuri was saying, that there is an opportunity if you ask the right questions and if you prod them the right way. And I don't think that it is something that only people with IQs of 150 and up are able to achieve. It is reasonable when you ask the right questions. And I think that that's probably an optimistic part of the message that we're bringing from practice to end on.
I will pick you up on the use of the word siloization, Michael. You've been an academic too long. Wait, a final point. I mean, leaders complain about complexity, speed of change, uncertainty, but in many ways, ecosystems increase these elements. So it must be a hard sell.
It depends on who it is that you are, right? I think that I'd say that it's a variable sell. I think there are some people who understand that the alternative is worse. And I think that for them, it is not a very difficult sell because they're like, well, you know, ultimately, we need to find new ways of competing. And I think that the idea of missing out on growth is important. Also, the idea of doing things that don't add up value is important. But then I think that it's a hard sell partly because it's complicated and partly because to do it right, you need to address part of the organizational challenges, including the politics that exist in any organization. So I'd say that it's a hard-ish sell, but it makes it easier because you're like, here's the reasons why you need to revisit what you've been doing. It gives you an extra legitimation. So couch it right, and I think it can go through. But I'd really be curious to see what Beppe and Yuri think about it.
Quick thought, Beppe?
Well, yeah, I can't add too much based on my experience, and that's exactly how Michael described it. And I must say that it's also very important how the process is facilitated and helped, and a lot of experience comes into the process. And the more you're experienced, the more you've done some mistakes, the easier. But again, there's not playbook, so it's a lot of learning by doing, and culture plays a key role because, as Michael said before, there is a lot of there are many nuances when it comes to different organizations in the internal processes and in the way they approach innovation.
A final word from Yuri, perhaps.
Maybe just a very short build on what both Michael and Beppe are saying is that I think complexity in ecosystem only becomes a problem when you're trying to force fit something that doesn't belong there, right? Whereas if you've got a clear understanding of what is it that you're trying to accomplish, what is the underlying synergy, what is the underlying benefit, and you're comfortable that the conditions for pursuing an ecosystem are met, then you're actually not really adding that much complexity. If you are, however, trying to pursue an ecosystem type benefit through M&A, then you're likely to create all the complexity that you didn't want, that then creates problems for the organization.
And let me, sorry, just a terrific point, Yuri. The whole point of the research on ecosystems is to say it isn't one thing. And, you know, my own effort saying, well, is it a multi-product or is it the multi-actor? What do you need it? What benefits do you expect? I think that if you are clear and if you didn't start with a buzzword only, then you can sort of move forward. And the entire premise behind the work that we've done, also the work that we've done in evolution with Yuri and working with Beppe's firm or others, is to try to pin it down and to move beyond the buzzword. So I'm a little bit more optimistic, provided that we keep the discipline in addition to the inspiration. You need the inspiration in order to drive change and in order to, you know, win the heart and mind of the key decision makers. But then you need the work of taking the ambition and pinning it down.
Execution needs strategy for breakfast, as they say, right?
Yep.
Brilliant. It's great to end on a positive note. Michael, really appreciate the conversation as always and your inputs. Beppe, Yuri, really great debate. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for Katie, for her contribution. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in and tuning in the future. Thank you very much and look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.